Hello and welcome to the Chatham House Global Trade Conference 2022. It's really a pleasure and honor to be back in person with so many of you. I think after 2 years of having these sessions virtual only, this is really wonderful. And I think, again, with many of you still joining us online, a real chance to take stock of where we are with regards to global trade and where we might be headed. We are here for the Global Trade Conference 8th edition, so a lot has changed obviously since we first held this conference. And the last 2 years in particular have been quite bumpy. I think many of us were expecting 2022 to be slightly better, but it wasn't supposed to be. I think global trade really faces major headwinds as we're facing multiple crises that weigh not just on trade, but the global economy more broadly, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine to ongoing competition with China, still very much pressures of monetary tightening, inflation, continuing effects of the pandemic. I mean, there are so many forces at play that it's not surprising that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, predicts that world merchandise trade volume will grow between 3.5% this year, but then drop to only 1% growth in 2023, which is a significant downgrade to what they had predicted earlier in the year. And so really government, businesses, but also societies are grappling with multiple challenges and navigating a very, very complex world. And I think today's sessions will really give you a flavor of those many aspects. At the first session, we're looking at the future of globalization, then doing a deep dive into the green agenda and whether that can transform global trade. We'll be looking at harnessing the power of digital trade and preparing the supply chains of tomorrow before finishing the day with the future of UK trade, perhaps a very particular session given the many challenges that the UK government is facing at the moment. But before we get started, let me take this opportunity to thank our partners, without whom this conference really would not be possible. So AIG, Altana AI, and the Hinrich Foundation, as well as our knowledge partner, McKinsey Global Institute, a big shout out to you, and also to everybody in the room. I really encourage you here and also those virtually to participate in the discussions today. It's going to be quite interactive, I hope. For those of you in person, please, when you want to come in, raise your hand. A microphone will come your way. Please stay seated and raise your question that way. For those of you online, you can submit questions via the chat function, and then I'll read them out on your behalf. There will, as you've just heard from my colleague, be a poll during this first session, so please do scan the QR code and participate. And for those of you online, again, it will just come through via the virtual platform. The discussions today are on the record. They will be recorded, and for all of you who cannot get enough of these discussions, you'll have a chance to go back to them, or if you have to step out for something, all of these conversations will be accessible on the conference platform after the conference. And please also feel free to tweet using the hashtag #CHTrade. Now we're going to jump straight into the first session, and I'm really delighted to be chairing that. My name, by the way, is Marianne Schneider-Petzinger. I'm a senior research fellow in the Global Economy and Finance program here at Chatham House, and the project director for the Chatham House Global Trade Policy Forum, which very much feeds into and builds on today's Global Trade Conference. I am joined by Ignacio Garcia-Becerro, Director of Multilateral Affairs, Strategy, Analysis, and Evaluation, quite a title there, Ignacio, at the European Commission in the Directorate General for Trade. My esteemed colleague, Yujie, Senior Research Fellow on China in the Asia-Pacific program here at Chatham House. Next to her is Youngmin Jong, a partner at McKinsey Global Institute, and then Stuart Patterson is joining us from the Hinrich Foundation, where he is a research fellow. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a lot of headwinds facing global trade, and I think that raises larger questions around whether we've reached an inflection point in globalization, particularly as we're coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, again, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, combined with the ongoing competition between China and the West, that has really raised the question of, have we reached peak globalization? Are we entering a new era of de-globalization, or is it rather, re-globalization? So, Ignacio, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that and how the EU, as a key player in global trade, is navigating this complex environment.
Well, thanks a lot, Marian, and it's really a pleasure to be here physically after the pandemic. What I would like to do is first to give you a bit of an assessment about scenarios. Are we entering into a de-globalization scenario, or are we actually coming into a new phase of globalization, what has sometimes been called, including by Dr. Negosi, re-globalization? Now, if you look into some of the hard data, I think there could be reasons to be optimistic. I mean, despite having been exposed to the shocks of the pandemic, the shock of the US-China trade war, and now the war in Ukraine, global value chains have shown to have a high degree of resilience. And if you actually look into the hard data, there is no evidence at this point in time that we have entered into a phase of deglobalization. Even if you look into US-China trade, where this trade went significantly down in 2019, now in global terms it has come back to a level that was similar to the one before the start of the US-China trade war. Of course, with a lot of variations depending on the sector that you are talking about. Now, it is true that trade integration reached a peak in 2008, and that since the global financial crisis, there has been a decline of the rate of trade integration. But still, this can be easily interpreted as a normal evolution of the process of trade integration. And the level of trade integration at this point in time, it is much higher than it was before the WTO was created. It is much higher than it was before at the end of the previous phase of globalization in 1913. So you could argue that all of this data shows that the world is now living with a high degree of economic integration. And although we would not be seeing the hyper-globalization that happened during 20 years of time, we are still going to have a situation in which there's a high degree of economic integration. And besides, of course, there's still a lot of potential, because if you actually look into trade in services, there you could argue that with technological developments, the potential for increased trade is very significant. And if you look into the many, many developing countries which are still not really integrated into the world economy, there's a big potential for those countries to develop through trade. Just look, for instance, into the whole of the African continent. So in principle, you could take a positive, optimistic narrative and say, let's not talk so much about deglobalization. Globalization needs to change, needs to adapt itself, but we are not going to be facing a situation in which we actually have a crash and that we go back to a very low level of trade and economic integration. Now, this being said, you can also be a bit more pessimistic. And the world has already experienced once a process of deglobalization. I mean, if you actually look into the trade data between 1913 and 1932, trade integration fell from 27% to 11% of GDP, even before the start of the Second World War. So there has already been once an instance in which actually trade integration has very significantly reduced. And it's clear that one of the reasons leading to military conflict was also the economic consequences of the lack of trade integration. And it was not a coincidence that the builders of the post-war trading system, or the post-war system, gave a lot of priority to the need to build trade institutions. So if you look at this from this perspective, I see at least 4 reasons to be concerned that we might be entering into a phase of deglobalization. One is that the United States, which played a pivotal role in the build-up of the rule-based trading system for a number of reasons, which of course would be long to discuss, it is very unlikely to be ready to continue to play an hegemonic role in support of a reformed globalization. At least it's not something that would happen naturally under US politics. It would need to be the result of a broader process of interaction. The second one is that the geopolitical tensions have clearly increased, and there is no signal at this point in time that there is a process of de-escalation. I mean, obviously, when it comes to Russia, I think decoupling from the Russian economy is here to stay. When it comes to US-China, I don't think that we see at this point in time a general process of decoupling, but there's a very significant decoupling which is taking place in the technology sector. And there's going to be a general effort to ensure that you can avoid dependencies which can be weaponized. So the potential for a negative feedback loop between the actions taken to reduce dependencies and geopolitical conflicts, the potential for a negative feedback loop is very significant, and there's always a risk that this could escalate out of control. Now, the third element, which I would say of tension, is the climate transition. Now, normally you would expect that this is a reason why countries should be ready to cooperate, and that therefore it should be a positive factor in terms of ensuring that we have a new phase of globalization. But at the same time, it seems to be clear that at this point in time, neither China nor the United States seem to be ready to put to one side the geopolitical conflicts when it comes to how to design their policies towards the climate transition. And of course, the fact that the European Union and the United States seem to be following quite different approaches to achieve net zero, again, it is a source of potential conflict. And finally, the global institutions of international trade, despite the successful WTO ministerial meeting, are quite weak, do not have a strong political support, and that makes it much more difficult to see how you can manage what is going to be a rather complex period of time with tendencies moving in the direction of de-globalization. So, after having given you a little bit of a gloomy perspective, let me say that at least from the policy point of view, in the European Union, we are very clear that the direction in which we should go is not de-globalization. It is making globalization more fair and more sustainable. And there are at least three important reasons for this. One, as I said, because still there's a very significant number of developing countries that need to rely on the process of integration into the global economy. And if you were going to move into a deglobalized world, they will be among the ones that would suffer the most. Secondly, because we think that the climate and the digital transition need to be managed in a cooperative manner. And without having the institutions that favor that, the risk that we actually fail to achieve the net zero objectives and that the tensions in the global trading system increase is a very significant one. And thirdly, because although it is clear that we are going to be living in a world in which economic security is going to become much, much more important than has been the case in the past because of the nature of the geopolitical conflict between the United States and China, we still think it's important to avoid the risk that economic security becomes the all-encompassing paradigm that governs the whole of international economic interaction. You need to have some guardrails to prevent a total fragmentation of the global trading system. So for those three reasons, we are of the view that one is to aim as much as possible towards a strategy which makes globalization fairer, more sustainable, and what should avoid the risk of us moving in the direction of deglobalization that would not only be economically very inefficient, I would say would also be quite risky from the security point of view. Now, how to do that? Well, that could be the subject of a long...
Can I press you on that in terms of the path forward? Do you still think that there is room for trade cooperation, and particularly from the EU's perspective, what might that look like? We have this concept of open strategic autonomy. We have new mechanisms of cooperation with the EU and the US, for example, in the form of the Trade and Technology Council. How do you see that fit together?
Yeah. Well, from the European Union perspective, I think that we would think that the way that one should try to think about the architecture of the global trading system is by looking into what I would call 3 concentric circles. First circle, the broadest one, is the WTO. We continue to think that it is essential to have a functioning global trade institution in which most countries in the world participate, and that we need to take seriously a process of reform that ensures that we have again a functioning dispute settlement system, and we have some degree of modernization of the rules, and that also provides a forum to cooperate on issues relating to the climate transition in their trade dimension, to issues relating to the digital transition. So we still think that the WTO is an important cornerstone that needs to be there in order to better manage globalization. But we should also be realistic. I mean, we are not going to be in a situation like the creators of the WTO thought about in 1995, where the WTO was going to be the center and where other activities would play a much more marginal role. I think you also need to be looking into other circles of cooperation. At least from the European Union perspective, trade and investment agreements continue to play a fundamental role when it comes to how to manage globalization, when it comes to how to enhance resilience, how to promote diversification. And that's what I think that we will still aim to, as much as possible, complete our network of trade agreements, and also to try to think about how to make trade agreements more useful as platforms for cooperation. Because a lot of the things that are going to be managed in the trade relations in the future are going to be the potential conflicts between the regulatory actions which are taken by trading partners. And one needs to think also about trade and investment agreements as platforms that facilitate cooperation with their countries. And then we cannot ignore that economic security has become a much bigger issue than has been the case before. Now, until recently, you could look into economic security as something that countries did autonomously with little cooperation with each other. I don't think that's the way that we should be thinking about economic security at this point in time. And I think that there should be, among like-minded democracies, a platform for cooperation on economic security-related issues. Now, this is something which, of course, at this point in time has not yet been created, but in my view, if you want to tackle some of the challenges about how to identify those aspects of the value chain where you can be exposed to significant dependencies, if you wanted to look into how to try to have better coordination on your policies on investment screening, on export controls. That, by the way, is something that we have started to do much more bilaterally with the United States as part of the TTC. But I think that potentially this is an issue which is not just a bilateral issue, and that should probably be somehow enlarged to a broader group of like-minded democracies. So that's, okay, so I stop there.
I'm sure lots of points to come back to, but I think also very good that you finish on a rather optimistic note. Again, that reminds me of the poll. If you haven't had a chance to please take a look. The poll is very much focused on the biggest threats to international trade, and some of the options range from inward-looking trade policies and protectionism to the geopolitical fissures, the decline of multilateral institutions, and inflationary and cost of living pressures. So a lot of those points, Ignacio, that you touched upon. And I think related to that is also very much the current debate of decoupling and reducing over-dependencies. So perhaps if I can turn to you now, Youngmin, around kind of concentration of production, how do you see that play out? And again, in the broader context of moving away from primarily global and multilateral efforts for trade to a much more regional approach.
Yeah, thank you. So before that, let me try to picture a broader, fact base in terms of what is happening in the world. So let me share 5 key observations from our upcoming discussion paper on the global flows, right? And then, first, let me start by building on awareness that we live in an interconnected world, right? So we talked about de-globalization and decoupling. They are becoming a popular narrative, right? But then, I want to build an awareness that we live in an interconnected world. If you think about the stuff that you use, 1/3 of the stuff that you use in terms of value-added terms, that's already crossed borders, right? And then out of that 1/3, 2/3 are actually coming from different geography, right? So they traveled long distance, like me, right? So we lived in an interconnected world. But then that's just a trade. But then there are also other ties binding us as well. For example, if you look at data flows, right? Data flows have been growing 50% per year over the decade. If you look at the international student flows, intellectual property flows, service sector flows, it has been growing about 5 to 6% per year over the past decade, which is double the pace of the trade, right? So therefore, my first observation, right? So we live in an interconnected world, which leads to my second observation, right? So, that interconnection makes us more resilient to the shock, to the volatility. If you think about COVID, right? So the images that we have is, congested ports, right? Or empty factories, right? That's the images that we have about COVID. And Ignacio shares some numbers. If you actually look at the 2021 trade data, it is record high. If you look at the other data flows, IP flows, again, it is record high, right? So, that interconnection makes us, more resilient. I survived my 2-month lockdown in Shanghai by watching Squid Game and by using all those, remote working platform, right? I was able to maintain my job, and here I am today, right? So, that connection makes us more resilient. But then, this resilience also makes us more interdependent. Therefore, my third observation is that no region is close to being self-sufficient, right? So we analyzed multiple categories of products across manufactured goods and resources across 8 different regions. And we basically found out that all regions have at least one type of product category that relies on import in order to meet more than 25% of their domestic consumption, right? So for example, China relies on energy from Middle East and Russia, but the Middle East relies on Europe in terms of getting pharmaceutical and machinery. But then Europe in turn relies on China and India to get the API, which is an ingredient of the pharmaceutical. So we live in an interdependent world, right? Then that leads to the concentration risk that Marian you talked about, right? So because we are interdependent, right? Sometimes there is a concentration risk, right? So that's what we are going through right now: the energy crisis, food crisis, right? Semiconductor shortages, right? Those crises are coming from concentrated products, right? But then concentration itself is neither good nor bad. It is a double-sided coin. Concentration, on the one hand, is an evidence of globalization. It's an evidence of specialization efficiency. On the other hand, when my supply is too concentrated, therefore I cannot find an alternative in short notice, then it becomes a risk, right? So therefore, how to manage this concentration risk is becoming a big deal, right? That is my fourth observation. And my fifth observation is then what do we do about this, right? How do we reimagine the next phase of the global flows? Our view is that the role of multinational companies will be very critical, right? Because 2/3 of the exports are done by the other multinational companies, and we talked about the importance of intangible flows, and multinational companies tend to have higher representation where intangible flows matter, right? And then also. We've also done a simulation of the value at stake of a manufacturing company in automotive sector. 40 to 60% of the value, enterprise value of large automotive multinational companies could be at stake, right? So therefore, what multinational companies will do will be very critical in terms of reimagining the next phase of the other global flows.
I'm really struck by this point that you make, that managing those concentration risks is critical, but what do you actually recommend companies do about that?
That's a very, very tough question, right? So probably 3 things that companies can think about. 1, diversify. If you can't diversify, substitute. If you can't substitute, be nice to your suppliers, right? So
sounds easy.
yeah. So in terms of diversification, right? So try to do a dual sourcing or triple sourcing, and we do a lot of firm level surveys, and that's what companies are moving toward, right? So more and more companies are trying to diversify their source, and we see this in electronics industry, for example. And second is substitute, right? So some of the concentration is very difficult to resolve, right? So especially the minerals, right? So it takes maybe 15 to 40 years to diversify. In that case, think about how you can innovate and then substitute some of the critical minerals with something else, right? So that's the second direction. Third direction, in terms of being nice to your supplier, right? So then, try to build a privileged relationship with your suppliers, making a long-term contract so that you can at least, secure, stable inflows, right, from your suppliers. Those are the directions.
Great. Now, we've just come out of the 20th Party Congress in China, and that has very much shed light on China's priorities going forward. But Yuji, kind of turning to you, what does that mean perhaps for China's economic growth as the world's leading trade nation, and also for China's integration into the world economy?
Thank you so much, Maria. And firstly, let me thank my Chatham House colleague, John and Sam, to have put this excellent conference together. Always delighted to come back to the big room after 2.5 years, actually, first time. Now, Marianne, to answer your second question, economic growth. What economic growth in China these days, I'm afraid? Probably hardly any. We're probably going to come around 2% by the end of this year to have a reasonable estimate for China's economic growth. Now, I just want to pick up the 2 points Ignacio's made related to economic security. After that entire week of the political language and bombardment, what I've realized is this seems to be a new era for China. A new era for China that selectively turning inward. I'm only using the word selectively turning inward. A new era for China that is extremely concerned on its own national security. I'm talking about national security in the broader sense, not just in terms of intelligence and foreign affairs, but national security that guarantee your food supply, guarantee your reasonable economic growth, but also guarantee your energy supply as well. So according to that 34,000 words political report, you don't need to read the whole thing, even just by go through the executive summary, the word on security has appeared more than 73 times, and the word on economy has appeared 68 times, which tells us how much the Chinese leadership consider that sense of economic security, that sense of self-reliance. It has put itself in that situation. I think this really come back to the large background, firstly, on the trade war between China and the United States in the past few years that has already eroding the export earning in relationship towards the Chinese GDP. Now, secondly, this is also in the bigger background of Russia's invasion towards Ukraine, and China would automatically have to think about its own supply chain, to what extent China can guarantee and self-sufficient for itself. Now, thirdly, this is also related to the recent technology competition, technology war between Beijing and Washington. China just naturally consider whether it be able to manufacturing itself to empower its own economy. Now, just a very, very specific example. In the past, the section on education, especially on higher education, grooming homegrown talents in China seems to be quite secondary. But 5 years after, so from 2017 to 2022 now, what we have now is China now become far more concerned that not able to have sufficient homegrown talents in terms of high-end technology sectors to be able to solve the readiness on semiconductors, to be able to offer the solutions on AI and quantum computing. And therefore, what I've noticed quite clearly is that sense of be able to producing its own homegrown scientists and engineers in order to empowering the economy. So that leaves to us that much of the talk and much of the policy measures from Beijing would be focusing on science and technology and less so on international trade. But it doesn't mean that Beijing is going to completely give up its firstly WTO membership or its pursuit on CPTPP, because China has always been the beneficiary of the globalization in the last 30 years to empower its economic miracle. That means China would be more interested in fixing its own domestic economic ooze through science and innovation investment, firstly. And secondly, China perhaps will go back to that old recipe by securing its border, by building somehow a friendly neighboring environment in order to facilitate its own economic growth. I mean, bear in mind, this is the country that shares 14 different borders with other countries. So obviously, by having a secure and relatively stable border, and that would be conducive to its own economic growth. And hence you have RCEP, I mean, Regional Economic Partnership. And you also have China's ambition, try to bidding for the CPTPP. And whether China can ultimately get into, that's another question. But this put aside, this also gives Beijing that somehow a stress that perhaps the much fraught relationship with the West is here to stay. And what I've noticed quite interestingly is that Beijing has decisively dropped the term, the windows of strategic opportunity, which has been referred in the past 20 years, suggesting that China would somehow maintain an amenable relationship with its own economic partners like United States and Europe. But it seems to be now that windows of strategic opportunity has been closed. And also Beijing has decisively and conspicuously dropped the term of the so-called new type of great power relationship. Again, this is a term that usually referring to having a stable relationship between China and the G7 advanced economies, and also with Russia as well. Again, they have decided to drop that term, and instead, what China stressed down developing its relationship with the so-called global south. And interestingly, in the political report, we refer that make sure the WTO, it is working for much of the larger global south countries, working for the developing countries. WTO should not be exclusively within the remit of the developed economies. So that is all very clear that China is not exactly give up the globalization. But I think perhaps it's the globalization in different shape that selectively turning inward, but also selectively deepening its engagement with the developing world rather than the developed world. So I think that's what we're heading towards. And overall, I do not necessarily think China can economically can prosper itself alone by only pursuing that sense of self-reliance. But I think ultimately, like any other countries in Europe, to think about your own economic security. And I think because of all this big geopolitical headwind, and this prompted Beijing to rethink its own economic security, but in a much broader sense.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. And you've set yourself up for me to follow up with this question on, what are actually the prospects of China joining CPTPP? And it's not just CPTPP, but also DIPA, the Digital Economy Partnership. So is that very likely to happen, or is it really just to signal that China is very much still trying, as part of its dual circulation strategy, to look outward while obviously having the selective self-sufficiency, but to signal that they're still active, whereas, for example, the US is very much still sitting on the sidelines despite having now this Indo-Pacific economic framework. But what's your take on that? What are the realistic prospects?
Well, I mean, I'm not a trade negotiator, so I'm not in the best position to say what is the prospect. But I think the determination is there, which is to using the rejoin CPTPP somehow offer that sense of structural economic reform, which is necessary for China if they want to ultimately have this sense of self-reliance on technology sector, if they want to build up a reasonable, stronger service-oriented economy and digital economy, and therefore join CPTPP is the only option. So I think it's really out of economic necessity that prompt Beijing realize the aspiration of join CPTPP, but whether they will ultimately get it or not, and I think that's really depends on the diplomatic and financial capital, how much Beijing willing to wade in. But of course, they come to the question of where do you place Taiwan in here as well. So I think that's the difficulties. Now, the second question is on dual circulation. I think Stuart is going to talk more about it, but dual circulation, put in this way, it is not exactly just focusing on domestic demand and supply, but it's also talking about a much different type of export growth that China would like to have. It is no longer just the economy relying producing toys and building infrastructures for other countries, but instead it's the country that decisively want to exporting more renewable energy technologies, want to export more on electric vehicles and those type of things. So it's more about a sense of upgrading its export earnings, less so about just shutting the store completely.
Great. lots on the table already that Stuart, I'm sure, is going to have thoughts on. But let me also react you to the results of the poll that have just come in. Again, the question is, what is the biggest threat to international trade? And 65% of those that responded said it is inward-looking trade policies and protectionism, followed by 29% who said geopolitical fissures. So that's quite clear there, whereas hardly any of you thought inflationary and cost of living pressures were key, 6% only. And nobody, as far as I can tell, said that the decline of multilateral institutions is a key threat. Perhaps we've all adjusted to the reality that the WTO faces multiple crises. And Ignacio, I'm sure, is going to have thoughts on that when we come back to that. But Stuart, let me offer you the chance to react to some of the things that you've heard.
Well, thank you. And it's great to be here in person for a change. Yeah, well, I think I'll start with a couple of observations. The starting point for me is that de-globalization started long before geopolitics raised its head. Okay, so we're more than 10 years into this. If we were to measure globalization by trade to GDP or cross-border capital flows relative to the stock of capital. Okay, so this is not a new thing. The global financial crisis brought an end to the period of hyper-globalization. So in that sense, part of this discussion is a little dated. I emphasize the point that all happened before geopolitics came to the fore, because clearly there was something not working with globalization before the geopolitics came into play. And so to gloss over that would mean that we draw the wrong conclusions as to how to put globalization back on a sustainable footing. However, I think we're right to point out that geopolitics is now driving the sort of bifurcation of the global economy. But I would also observe that people tend to overestimate what globalization really was, or the global nature of cross-border trade and capital flows, because if you look at US, the largest economy in the world, and its trade patterns, obviously about a third of its trade takes place with its NAFTA partners, who collectively represent a rounding error in terms of the global economy. And within the European Union, the majority of trade is intra-EU. And since the global financial crisis, clearly China's trade patterns have been reorientated along geopolitical lines to its own backyard in ASEAN and Central Asia and the global south more generally. And within Africa, really, all the trade takes place between four countries, and middle powers tend to trade not so much with each other, but with a global superpower, which is what CPTPP, what makes that unique, is that there isn't a trade superpower in it. And if I was going to stick my neck out, I would say the chances of China drawing are just about zero. However, after the UN vote on Xinjiang, I would say that maybe they've gone up a little bit from zero. It's very hard to put forward a case for China joining, and it's be a great measure of China's geopolitical influence and the influence it's brought through Belt and Road and its preferential trading patterns as to whether it manages to get close to joining. So where do we go from here? And what are the impacts of Ukraine, Russia, etc.? I mean, to my mind, what the Russian invasion of Ukraine has highlighted are a couple of things. First of all, the increasing bifurcation of the world along ideological lines between totalitarian or authoritarian regimes and democracies. It's very hard now for companies to ignore this. And obviously, we had this discussion last year, and the warnings were there. But a lot of multinationals have left a lot of money on the table in Russia as a result of their reluctance to embrace what I consider to be the geopolitical realities of trade at the moment. So it's been very expensive. I mean, I think we're starting to see people planning and taking account of the probability that they're forced to do the same in China. And so as the cost of capital rises for taking on jurisdictional risk, the market will actually do quite a lot of the decoupling anyway, right? Because clearly in your internal calculations, when you're looking at what kind of returns on capital you need for those cross-border investments, that number is rising, not as a result of the interest rate cycle, but as a result of the jurisdictional risk. And so we are seeing a diversification process in supply chains, but it takes a long time. So I think it's fairly clear where the US stands on China and where China stands on globalization. I think China has turned its back on the multilateralism. Made in China 2025 was a clear indication that its mercantilism was going to continue. There's been no progress of any meaningful nature in terms of liberalizing capital controls. There's been no progress in terms of liberalizing the exchange rate. So, the commanding heights of Chinese macroeconomic policy remain decidedly mercantilist, and the industrial policy remains the same. The United States' export controls on semiconductors, mean we're moving into a new era of containment rather than simply pushback in order to try and induce some sort of concession from the Chinese. And the EU, I think, is trying to tread some sort of middle path. In my view, Germany is leading the charge, and particularly the German auto industry, in terms of trying to ignore the geopolitics. But as China's economy stagnates, that narrative that China provides the future and therefore you've got to be a part of it and you're leaving a lot of money on the table if you actually implement your values and adhere to them, that narrative starts to lose its potency. And I think we're seeing that. I don't know how many people in the room follow, for example, the EU Chamber of Commerce in China, but they've been a wonderful barometer with a lag of how business attitudes have changed towards doing business in China. The chairman works for BASF, which obviously is one of the 8 European companies that account for about 80% of the investment in China, right? So we're talking about a very powerful, very small number of European companies that have been propagating the pro-engagement narrative with China, and even they are beginning to give up on it. So I'm really bullish about CPTPP because I think that this is a forum for middle powers, not superpowers, in which we can not suffer from the over-inclusiveness of WTO, which it has been the big barrier to progress in trade liberalization, by limiting it to market-orientated economies that are actually interested in the economic welfare gains from free trade. And it would be a huge mistake to pollute that membership with economic superpowers who are intent on using it for geopolitical purposes. I mean, just to push back slightly on Yuja's point about the discipline of CPTPP, if I read it right, being what China needs in terms to liberalize its economy. China's quite capable of liberalizing its economy off its own volition if that is the chosen policy path they wish to go down. It clearly isn't the policy path. So application for CPTPP is simply a spoiler move, and it would be great for them to get in there, but it doesn't really bring them anything that their Sino-centric trade oriented patterns that they've created in their near neighborhood haven't brought them already. So anyway, I'll leave it there for now, and I'm sure we'll come back with questions.
Yeah, you're just going to respond very quickly to that.
Very quickly. I mean, it's not exactly Sino-centric trade pattern as such. If you actually look into the RCEP, it's actually led by ASEAN. It is not led by China. China is just merely the beneficiary because of the size of the economy for that. So I'm back to defer.
And Stuart, you mentioned on the one hand there is, again, this new era of containment, authoritarianism versus democracy, which seems to suggest we're moving into a new era of block building or at least fragmentation. But on the other hand, you also stressed that there is an opportunity for middle powers to take on an increasing role, which suggests that we're not actually seeing the formation of very stark blocks. So where do you stand on that?
No, well, I mean, if you're Australia or New Zealand or the UK, for that matter, and you're not in, you're a middle power, and you're, not tied into the legislative infrastructure of a big trading bloc, you've got a very difficult decision to make in terms of navigating the Cold War and the sort of geo-economic pressures that you're going to come under from the United States and from China. I see the majority of relatively affluent middle powers siding very much with the United States on this, because I think it's in their interest to do so from a security perspective, right? And ultimately, most of those middle powers, the democratic ones at least, do depend upon the United States for their security umbrella. But I did think it was interesting that in the export controls and in the chip alliance that the United States are trying to put together, that cooperation with Europe was not forthcoming, really. And my sense is that Germany is going through some navel gazing as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war, and the trade dependencies that's highlighted, and perhaps some of the naivety or malfeasance even of its policymakers in the past towards Russia. And that they are moving bit by bit towards a more alignment with the United States, but obviously it has to be dressed up in the guise of strategic independence.
Great. I'm going to open up the floor for questions in a moment, just kind of signaling where the microphones can be making their way over in this corner is one of the first questions. But first of all, let me each of you give kind of an opportunity to kind of respond to some of the points that we've heard. And I think one of the things that came out to me is that, yes, we're seeing this increased emphasis on working with like-minded partners, friendshoring, as some call it in the US. But at the same time, it's still very much that there is areas of competition and managing differences amongst those group of like-minded countries. So Ignacio, particularly for the EU, how does the EU plan to manage those trade-offs? On the one hand, again, very much competition primarily with China, but to some extent also competition with the US.
Well, that's a challenging question, Marian, because I think that it is clear that we are strong allies of the United States. We share the same values, and it's in the course of the Biden presidency, there has been a genuine effort to improve trade relations with the United States. But at the same time, yes, there are tensions, there are issues that need to be managed. Now, when it comes to economic security issues, if I can also comment on what Stuart has said, there has been a very, very close cooperation with the United States on all the questions which relate to the conflict with Russia. So there has been close cooperation on issues relating to sanctions to Russia, export controls, much less so far when it comes to the dynamics with China. And that's what I think the point which I made before is something which I would really like to emphasize. We are certainly going to enter into a phase where economic security is going to become much more central for the trading system that has been up to now. And this can only work if there is sufficient dialogue and cooperation among allies. And that is something which I think we have some channels of cooperation with the United States, but I don't think that is enough. You would need to build up a stronger framework of cooperation on economic security. It has to be two ways. It cannot be just one side saying, this is what needs to be done, please follow me. It has to be a more two-way dialogue. Now, just one point which I would make on the whole issue of trading blocks. I mean, the European Union is certainly not going to just accept to limit itself to trade with Europe or to trade with the neighborhood. We are global trading power. We are interested in trading all over the world. We are very present in the Indo-Pacific. We are very present in Latin America, and I think that we should further deepen that presence. So I don't think, quite frankly, that the CTBP is the only game in town if you actually want to diversify your economy and you want to trade with other people in the world. I think, however, that a very fundamental challenge is Africa. And that's what I think one of the critical issues that will be important for Europe will be how to enhance its trade and investment relationship with Africa, because this is also the group of countries which at this point in time are not really integrated in the global economy, and it would be a big pity if the geopolitical conflict was basically to leave Africa to one side.
One question in the far corner, and if you could please briefly identify yourself.
Richard Curry, I work for UPS. I just wanted to ask the panelists the following question, which is, I believe that one of the threats to global international trade is its lack of inclusivity. There are too few small and medium-sized companies that perform cross-border trade. And one of the reasons that they don't do it is that they believe that cross-border trade is too complicated, that customs and trade facilitation processes are too complicated for them to remain compliant and still trade across border. Now, one of the speakers mentioned that it's sort of global trade is seen as the reserve of the multinational corporation. And I think that's one of the reasons why global trade is coming under such pressure, because multinational corporations are seen as unpopular. I think one of the ways to reverse that and to deal with that threat is to make trade more inclusive, but we're going to have to make cross-border processes, customs and trade facilitation processes, far simpler, and be able to communicate that to small and medium-sized businesses to encourage them to trade. And then once they do trade, we've got people in there who can go out and advocate for trade. And I think that's going to be very powerful.
Great. Did I miss any other hands? Let's take this one and then come over here.
Hi, good morning. Andrew Smith, the High Commissioner of Canada. So I had a question. You were talking a little bit about economic superpowers, and I'd like to ask about the fifth largest economy, about India. It's got a push now for globalization. It's looking at integrating its supply chains into the global supply chains. They were a part of RCEP, but I think they pulled out for reasons of China, a China-led pact. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about what the prognostication is for India and its drive to integrate. It's negotiating a number of free trade agreements as well, so I'll leave that with you.
Great, and there is also a question on India online, so let me just throw that in here at this point, and it's particularly around the chair of the G20 that India is going to take on in 2023, and related to that, whether any of you would like to comment on India's role in the world economy and the international institutions. Question over here, and then I'm going to give you a chance to respond, and we'll open it up for another round later. But please.
Hi, Alan Beattie from the Financial Times, and indeed also from Chatham House. Picking up on Stuart's point about mid-sized economies being forced to choose, as it were, a new Cold War. Of course, also a bunch of big middle-income countries. India is one, Brazil is another, which at the moment have feet very much in both camps. Right? Brazil has a Mercosur deal ready to go, and it wants the US's help to get into the OECD. At the same time, it sells, I think, about 80% of its soybeans to China. Now, the question is, how long can those countries, diplomatically and economically, continue to have feet in both camps? And critically, is it actually in the interests of the US or a US-led bloc to try and make them choose? Or will we end up, to use your Cold War analogy, which I think is very interesting, will we end up with the equivalent of a large non-aligned movement as we go forward?
Great questions. Lots to tackle there. Youngman, any initial thoughts and reactions?
Yeah, especially the question about inclusivity. Absolutely critical question, right? And in the previous era of globalization, we enjoyed a lot of benefit, right? So globalization made the trade cheaper. Therefore, we enjoyed the cheap products and a lot of innovation from those intangible flows, right? But then at the same time, there was a cost associated with it, and which is the inclusivity point. So therefore, if we want to reimagine the next year of globalization and how to make it more sustainable and inclusive will be a very critical factor. And then, for that matter, the role of multinational companies and also the SMEs will equally matter, because SMEs will be the suppliers to large multinational companies, right? So therefore, from a big company perspective, how do we work better with SMEs? And on the one hand, those the rules and governance about the trade processes, etc., that will matter. On the other hand, technology could also help, right? Using the AI engines, right? The machine translation. The e-commerce platform, those can be actually helpful in terms of reducing the friction of the global trade and supply chain, which could help the small and medium enterprise to become so-called micro multinational, right? So therefore, how do we innovate more and help SMEs to adopt more of those technologies? That will be a critical factor in order to make the next phase of globalization work. In terms of India, I think that the trend of regionalization will be a good opportunity. Especially, we see the rising trend of regionalization in Asia, right? And then, when you do more regionalization, it tends to shorten the value chain and make it also more resilient. And also the diversification initiative of many companies, which have a lot of footprint in China, they tend to choose Southeast Asia or India, right? So therefore, it could create a good opportunity for India to be more integrated into the global value chain.
Eugene.
Sure. Just follow on India's question and also on the role on the G20. And what we have seen so far is that India seems played quite a flexible role on the choice on Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and which is quite a surprising role for many of the Western advanced economies in here. I think that's really largely depends on India's traditional partnership with Russia in the past, and also that tradition of long aligned movement. I think I quite agree with Alan's point in here. We're probably going to see a much bigger non-aligned movement among various middle powers in here. And also, we're probably going to see India going to play a much bigger and flexible role because they're not as entrenched as between China and the United States in this sense of geopolitical competition. But nevertheless, given the size of the economy, and I think for India, given as the host of the G20, I think they will probably would give G20 a chance to revitalize itself after so many years that G20 has been really sitting on the silence, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Ignacio?
Actually, no, I wanted to comment on the three questions because they are really great questions. Now, on the point on inclusivity of trade, I would very much agree, and it allows me also to comment on something that Stuart said before. It is certainly not the case that the problems with globalization started with the geopolitical impact on trade. I mean, there were problems with globalization that were clearly predating, and if you actually wanted to find a way of making globalization sustainable, the issue of inclusivity is going to be key. Now, inclusivity has many dimensions. It has the SME dimension that you have referred to. You have the question about how to ensure the greater inclusivity vis-a-vis those vulnerable developing countries which are currently playing a marginal role in international trade. It has domestic inclusivity. So I think if you actually want to find a way of making globalization work, this issue of inclusivity is going to be quite critical. By the way, I don't think it is actually a coincidence that one of the few successes of the WTO has been the trade facilitation agreement, because that hit a little bit the right spot, something which was clearly in the interest of all trading countries, and which at the same time had a value for business. So I think that type of agreements are the agreements which I still think that the difficult as it is, you might still be able to develop in the context of the WTO. And that's why it's important that there are currently discussions in the WTO on issues like investment facilitation or e-commerce. Now, on the role of the big democratic emerging economies, India, Brazil, South Africa. Now, the first thing which I would say is Russia is not China. I mean, quite frankly, we would expect that all of those countries would see that clearly in face of such an egregious breach of international law as the invasion of Ukraine, they would not be standing neutral and they would be taking a clear side on that conflict. Now, when it comes to the issue of trading with China, that's a totally different perspective. I think that the new president of Brazil, Lula, has made a statement indicating that they are not ready to make choices, that they would wish to trade with China, that they would wish to trade with the West. And I think it would be very, very unwise for anyone to try to push those countries to make a choice. And in the end, the critical question to see whether the WTO is going to be able to play a role or not in the new phase of globalization is where, despite the geopolitical conflict, despite the technological competition, the United States and China still see that they have a common interest on keeping a functioning global trading system. mean, I hear from what you just said that China probably would say yes, although I'm not clear what it means. I think we would say yes as well, and I think it's also going to be important how the United States positions itself on that issue. Finally, India clearly is a key player in the WTO. One would really hope that this chairmanship of the G20 would also imply India playing a constructive role in the whole process of WTO reform over the next 2 years.
And Stuart.
Yeah, so nothing to add on the UPS question. I completely agree that SME participation is important. Piling trade agreements on top of each other that actually are largely replicating rules that already exist does nothing to help inclusiveness in trade. I hope technology is the answer in terms of lowering the costs, but you're also right that there has to be a training and investment in education about what the real costs of trade are and how they can be reduced. Is it in the US's interest to force them to choose? And the answer, I think, is no. Because they have to make a choice themselves. I agree that the non-aligned movement, as it were, if you like, people trying to play both sides, is going to be large in terms of global population and up to a point in terms of global economics. But I think you hit the nail on the head when you said Brazil sells 60% of its soybeans to China. Does the future of Brazil lie in selling soybeans? Does the future of Africa lie in mineral extraction to China? Or does the future of these countries actually lie in moving up the value chain and actually competing with China in the manufacturing of capital goods, etc.? And I think that what's going to lead what we would now consider to be not aligned countries out of the China camp is the very similar reasons that have led to the disillusionment in the United States and Europe with the trade relationship and investment relationship with China, which is it is decidedly asymmetric in terms of market access. And that the statist approach that China has to industrial subsidies, etc., mean that in many ways China has eaten most of these countries' lunches when it comes to economic development in manufacturing. I mean, real manufacturing wages in Mexico are lower now than they were when China acceded to WTO. There's a reason for that, right? That China joined WTO with wage levels that were a 30th of those prevailing in the developed world and a fifth of Mexico's. And through state subsidy, China was able to create this huge scale and efficiency in manufacturing. So I don't think China, the United States or Europe or any other democracy should force these countries to choose. But if they want access to leading edge technology and if they want access to these markets, they will ultimately, I think, have to declare a hand up to a point. And I think that, we're already seeing considerable disillusionment with BRI and the relationship, the bilateral relationship between the global South and China on a trade basis. And with regards to India specifically and India's ambiguity on Russia, Ukraine, and RCEP, I think India clearly sees an opportunity from China in the sense that China has cost escalation means China was shedding low value added manufacturing anyway before geopolitics came into play. India needs a manufacturing base and needs to grow its manufacturing base. This is a great opportunity, but equally, free trade is a dirty phrase in India at the moment with the Modi government. So up to a point, I would say ducking RCEP was a function of the Sino-centrality of the organization, but it was also, completely consistent with India's reluctance to fully liberalize trade domestically. So, I used to live in India, and I remember as a young man arriving there and meeting an old hand, and he said, India's like the electric car. It always will be a thing of the future. Well, the electric cars arrived, so maybe India's moment in the sun has also come about. There's. I think there is a tremendous opportunity here, but India is going to pursue its own path. Economically, I don't think any of these countries can be cajoled into declaring an alignment that they're not ready to make.
Great set of questions and lots of hands going up. So we're going to try to get to as many as possible. Starting over there, and I'm going to make my way this way. And again, if you could briefly identify yourself and keep it also quite brief. Thank you.
I will try. Hi, Michael Gassiorek, UK Trade Policy Observatory. I'm struck by how much of the discussion, which has been very, very interesting, by the way, is focused around sort of nation states and their actions and then being driven by geopolitical constraints or economic security constraints and so on. But I guess what I'm also, and so in a sense, it's about driven by external factors, as it were, external relations. But I wanted to pick up on the question from the gentleman behind me regarding inclusivity, which is what drives those actions of nation states in terms of their internal politics, the internal dimension. And this also picks up on something that Ignacio said about inclusivity. I mean, part of, I think, the challenges that we face is that globalization has been seen not to benefit people within countries, not necessarily across countries equally. And we've seen the rise of populist pressure within countries. We've seen this, for example, in the UK with the Brexit referendum. We've seen this with sort of trade policy reversals like Trump tariffs. And I'm wondering what the panel thinks are the domestic pressures which may shape the future. I don't think to threaten globalization. Globalization is just changing its shape, but how those domestic pressures may shape the future of globalization. Thank you.
Great. Back row.
Thank you. Good morning. Bernard O'Donovan. I work for the Irish Fisheries Regulator. Just an observation is that Ireland is a small local economy. In one way could be seen as a proxy for the uncertainties regarding global trade, because obviously we're very exposed to it. But my question is for the panel, please. When we consider the risks and impacts on global trade, we talk about economic nationalism, we talk about food security, energy security, ideological global challenges and so on. But ironically, the one issue that has brought global trade to its knees in the last number of years has been environmental, because we were more interested as a species in staying alive and staying healthy than trading with one another. So I would like to ask the panel, please, in terms of the future of globalization or re-globalization or de-globalization, whatever word we're going to use, what are we going to do and how can we consider, I think, the very prescient risk of environmental challenges, which certainly historically in the last 2 years has been shown to refocus humanity towards staying alive and staying healthy rather than trading with one another globally. Thank you.
Great question. I'm sure one that we'll get to in the second session as well. One question over here and over there, and then hopefully I've gathered them all.
Hello, Cyril Lenoel from the Department for International Trade. I had one question on the sort of a multipolar world. So assume that you have a world led by US and EU on one side and China on the other side. Then sort of what recommendation would you have to businesses in terms of their investment in China? At the moment, they have a lot of joint ventures, but there's a lot of risk associated to it. So what kind of business relationship should they turn to in that scenario? And the other question is on WTO reform. Could you give some more practical things that could be done, to sort of re-energize the WTO? Thank you.
I'm going to take the opportunity to add to that question on WTO reform, given that there is one question online that asked whether the solutions are primarily going to be political or technical. So perhaps we can link that discussion. One question over here, and then again, an opportunity for everybody on the panel to offer their thoughts. Please.
Hi, thank you. John from Chatham House. We've been talking a lot about trends in this session, but I'm also quite interested in shocks. So obviously for the past 3 years, what often seems impossible or extremely unlikely suddenly becomes possible. And in a pressured international environment, these kind of systemic shocks are becoming more frequent. So using, I guess, Russia as a case point, I think looking back on, say, where we were even a year ago, do you think the case of Russia of looking to isolate a major global economy, which is something unprecedented, do you think it has demonstrated the vulnerability or the resilience of the economic system to this? Because you could look at it both ways. There's examples of sanctions went further than many people thought were possible, but on the other side you see US microchips in Russian cruise missiles. So you could argue it both ways.
A broad range of questions, but given that we only have 5 minutes, I'm going to ask each of you to pick and choose and be very succinct in your answers. Stuart, please.
Well, can I address this issue here? Because when I started off by saying that actually peak globalization was reached at the global financial crisis well before geopolitics had raised its head, that's what I was alluding to, was the fact that clearly it wasn't working. It depends, obviously, what you mean by working. And I think that actually, and this is probably going to anger quite a lot of people in the room, I think that the economics profession has let society down quite badly in terms of its analysis of the welfare gains from trade, primarily by focusing on the consumer welfare gains from deflation. Trade is inherently deflationary. That's how people gain market share, by producing stuff cheaper. And the nexus between the deflationary impact of trade and a monetary policy being set to create inflation. 2% is the target that most developed world central banks use. And the asymmetry that is created in economies where obviously all the inflation has had to come in the service sector and asset prices, while China has continued to churn out ever cheaper TVs, washing machines, and everything else, and the schisms that has created in society. Because if you were an asset owner, you've done incredibly well out of lower interest rates, because we've had to have ever lower interest rates, ever lower real interest rates, and then quantitative easing in order to fight the deflation from trade. That's gone straight into asset prices, and economies in the developed world have been, either they've held on to manufacturing through state subsidy or a fairly statist approach to manufacturing to compete with China, or they've lost their manufacturing and become asset jobbers. This country probably being the best example of that, right? And so, it's been incredibly divisive internally, and I think it's largely down to this conflict between creating inflation, or the central banks fear that they have to have inflation in highly indebted economies, because deflation would be disastrous for the financial system or what have you. And the schisms the generational schisms, and obviously the occupational schisms that has created. And so I do think that there is a lot of domestic pressure, but against hyperglobalization. I don't think that we've done a very good job of alleviating that. I mean, I don't think that we've analyzed the cost-benefit analysis of trade very well. Think of the unfunded pension fund contributions, for example, that have gone through the roof as a result of the lower discount rates and the lower returns on financial assets that people...
Can I interrupt you there to just finish up very briefly, because we do also have the networking break right after this, so you have plenty of opportunities to go into
one
that.
Final word.
The key takeaway.
LDI, liability-driven investment, right? We haven't seen the end of this. This is nothing to do with Kwasi Kwarteng, okay? For the last 20 years, pension funds around the world have been investing in financial assets that will probably produce negative real returns. Wait till that particular item hits the fan, and that could be laid at the door of globalization, in my view.
Yeah, in terms of sustainability, that's why we need to make global flows work. For example, energy transition will be also mineral intensive, and there's a significant interdependence, right? So the mineral demand going forward will rise by 4 to 6 times in the coming 20 to 30 years, right? So that's why we need to make global flows work. In terms of solution, political solution matters, but also business solutions matter as well. That's why we emphasize the role of the multinational companies. And whether we are heading toward multipolar or not, three things that companies can think about. One, how to take advantage of this new phase of globalization in terms of intangibles. Two, how to enhance resilience for yourself. Three, how to enhance resilience for the system overall.
Sure. Just regarding internal pressure, domestic pressure, actually for China it's the opposite. If you have a larger growing number of middle class, actually they naturally prefer to allow China to be more opening and to be able to engage the world even further. So I think that's really opposite compared with large part of this world, firstly. And secondly, I think what Xi Jinping was recently talking about, common prosperity, essentially is about closing that income gap between the urban that enjoy the benefit of a hyper-globalization in the past, but for those who in the backwater have not really been enjoying that benefit. So I think there's a different policy direction here. But I think overall, if you're talking about China, it would be the internal pressure, the domestic pressure. So hoping the leadership will keep the country open. I think that's really the opposite. Now, on the multipolar world, I'm afraid if we constantly have this mindset of that China eating everyone's lunch, and we're probably just going to have an even more divided and more polarized the world. And if we're constantly thinking in the zero-sum game, in zero-sum mindset, I'm afraid more inclusive WTO will not be the end in sight.
Ignacio?
Well, actually, very, very briefly, a problem which I think is hard to solve if one looks into the issue about how to promote inclusivity, how to respond to the problems of those who have been left behind by the globalization process, is that there's a limited amount that trade policy can really do to respond to that. I mean, if one looks into the challenges, some of them have to do with macroeconomic policies, and if you actually wanted to correct those challenges, you would really need to look into the macroeconomic sphere much more than into the trade sphere, or they have to do with weaknesses in the domestic policy process. And again, how much of those issues can really be fixed through the trading system? But of course, the trading system, inevitably, it is actually living with the consequences of this lack of inclusivity. Now, on WTO reform, it is fundamentally a political issue, it's not a technical issue. And I think it really hinges on two fundamental political questions. I mean, there is a geopolitical conflict between the United States and China. We have trade and technology as a very important part of a sphere of competition. But despite that, the US and China see that it is in their interest to maintain a sphere of cooperation in trade. And that sphere of cooperation in trade is what the WTO can provide. And that is fundamentally a political question. It's not a technical issue. And then the other fundamental question is for some of the major emerging economies, how far they see the WTO as an institution that has a value for them, or how far they see the WTO as a political problem in which they don't want to invest because it creates negative political repercussions back home. I'm not mentioning any country, but I think that is another important challenge to see whether the WTO can work.
Great. This has been a tremendous first session to kick us off. In many instances, we've covered a whole range of issues, but at the same time, barely scratched the surface. So we'll get into many of those issues going forward, particularly in the next session on how will the green agenda transform global trade. So we'll be back here in half an hour after the networking break. Thank you so much to our panelists and for great participation.